populism is a response to the suppression of democracy. And so people go into the street because they're being ignored and democracy doesn't function. To physically get together every weekend on the Champs-Élysées with all these strangers from all over France, they looked absolutely thrilled to find each other.
Hello and welcome to The Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill. This is a podcast in which an esteemed guest joins me to talk about the big ideas, the bad ideas, the problems and the controversies of life in the early 21st century. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by John Rick MacArthur. Rick is president and publisher of Harper's Magazine. He has worked as a reporter for numerous newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Sun-Times. He was also an assistant editor at United Press International. He's the author of a number of books, including Second Front, Censorship and Propaganda in the 1991 Gulf War, and You Can't Be President, The Outrageous Barriers to Democracy in America. He writes for the French-language newspaper Le Devoir, and also for Harper's, of course, and he has developed a very strong reputation as a writer and publisher who is willing to stand up for freedom of speech and other increasingly contested liberal values. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start off with a broad question, if I may, about the state of freedom of speech, because there almost seems to be a controversy every week about some article or some statement or some comment that some person has made. Of course, Harper's experienced it itself quite recently, notably with Katie Roife's piece on Twitter, Feminism, during which there was a storm even before it had been published, a kind of preemptive Twitter storm, and a most extraordinary attacks on her and Harper's, and even a kind of attempted blackmailing of other Harper's contributors to stop contributing in a kind of defiance of this magazine that would dare to publish such an article. And this happens more and more across the Western world, particularly in the US and in the UK. And it seems to me that one of the great threats to freedom of speech now is not so much the boot of the state clamping down on ideological sinners, but the mob, a kind of this intolerant, illiberal mob, which presumes that it can go through life without ever encountering an idea that it finds disagreeable.
Yeah, it's a lot like a stoning, actually, an 18th century stoning or something. To me, it's the most remarkable thing. Part of me refuses to take it seriously, which is perverse, because I have to take it seriously because I'm not on social media. All this stuff is reported to me by my public relations person and my friends and so on who are on social media. But when I do look into it and I actually read what people have said about me, most recently about the John Hockenberry piece we published, who was describing his life post-Me Too in exile, as we called it, the violence and the fury of the emails and the Twitter storm were remarkable. And even someone as not hardened, but as used to it as I am, because I've been through a lot. I defended Salman Rushdie. My name was in the newspaper when it was scary. And I organized the counterattack. I really did organize. Jerry Maserati and I organized the counterattack in New York when everybody was terrified they were going to get killed. And so I've been through much worse than Twitter. But even that being said, it's really remarkable. The ferocity is remarkable. And you can understand why people are intimidated. And it is, of course, narrowing the debate because now people are self-censoring as never before. The great paradox of this country is, as Tocqueville pointed out a long time ago, he was wrong about a lot of things, actually, Tocqueville, but he was right about this, that yes, you can say anything you want in the United States and get away with it, so to speak, but you also have to face marginalization, complete marginalization. You have to be willing to just step outside of society and live there because polite company today is Me Too orthodoxy, diversity orthodoxy. For a while, it was free trade orthodoxy, which is something I want to talk about if we can, which is something that the ruling class and the financial interests love. those things cannot be talked about. They just can't be talked about. No one's going to volunteer to have their head cut off.
Yes. I wanted to ask you about where that ferocity comes from, because that's a very good description of it. And almost like a metaphorical stoning is a very good description too. And you see it so often these days. I mean, for example, Germaine Greer, a previously esteemed feminist, now finds it very difficult to speak on campuses in the UK because she is trans skeptical. She doesn't think a man can become a woman, no matter how much hormone treatment he or she undergoes. You see it in relation to anyone who dared to venture any criticism whatsoever of the Me Too movement, who were immediately lumped in with sexual predators themselves as kind of complicit in that supposed culture of sexual predatory behavior. And the response is always incredibly ferocious and horrifying sometimes, the things that are said about people. So what is the driver to that? Is it simply, where does such a kind of visceral sense of intolerance come from, do you think?
Well, I think it comes from people feeling marginalized, paradoxically. They feel like they have no voice, and that the media is, as Louis Lapham used to say, an occupying army that has no respect for them. And suddenly along comes the internet, and everyone's got their own printing press or soapbox, and they can scream and curse and say everything that they've always wanted to say but couldn't say it. And sometimes they get a reaction. So I suppose it's kind of exhilarating for someone who feels like they have no power, no place as a citizen, because citizenship has been passé in this country for sort of on and off, but for a long time. The whole idea of being a citizen and participating just doesn't have the excitement or the weight of being able to scream on Twitter. You don't want to go to a meeting and debate other people when you can just sit at your computer keyboard and say anything that comes into your head. So I have actually some sympathy for these people. Right. I really do. And it's an immense waste of time. If I tell my writer friends, because everybody does it, I was witness to I think the birth of, I guess you could call it the liberal surrender to social media at the Penn banquet 5 years ago, I believe it was, when Salman Rushdie was, ironically, Salman Rushdie was the president of Penn. And they honored the chairman of Twitter. I can't remember his name. And at a certain point when you honor these guys, they buy a lot of tables, and that's the reason you do it. To me, that was enough. But somewhere in the middle of the program, they decided to make a protest against Turkish censorship, I think. The Turks had thrown some people in jail, as usual. And they did it by Twitter on the spot. So everybody, all these very famous writers, raised their iPhones to the ceiling or to the sky. This is the Museum of Natural History on Central Park West, and twittered messages to the Turkish government, like primitive men discovering fire or something. It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. I said, I didn't realize how bad it was because, of course, this is 3 years before Trump gets elected president. But suddenly you go from literary liberals celebrating Twitter to Donald Trump using Twitter as his only form of communication. It was the beginning of something horrible.
Yeah. I want to ask you in a minute about Penn and Rushdie and Charlie Hebdo and a few other things in relation to that organization in particular. But I just wanted to touch on something you said there about the sense of exhilaration some of these Twitch hunters or Twitter mobs seem to get. I thought there was a very good example of that recently in the UK in relation to Sir Roger Scruton, the famed and esteemed conservative philosopher who was sacked by the Conservative government in response to a bit of a stitch-up by the New Statesman, which interviewed him and then took some of his quotes out of context and so on. And what was striking about that is that the New Statesman journalist who conducted this hit job took a photograph of himself drinking from a bottle of champagne and put it on Instagram and said, this is the feeling you get when you take down someone like Roger Scruton. And I often think that the reason publishers like you are important is that there is often a symbiotic relationship between this search for the exhilaration that comes from claiming a scalp or from knocking someone off their pedestal And the cowardice that sometimes exists among traditional liberal institutions, or even among some liberal publications, who kowtow to that, or who stop saying the things people don't want them to say, or don't publish the thing people don't want them to publish. So I often think that the process you describe, where people are at home on their internet screaming and trying to get someone silenced, is often energized and exacerbated by the...
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't finish my point about the people who should know better, because presumably the liberals of all people would know better. I can't actually reveal his name because I'm trying to be ethical, and keeping my word is still important, although it's less and less important in this country. But a very prominent journalist called me yesterday to scream bloody murder at me about something we published in Harper's. And I said to him, come on, I started out listening like publishers always do, because I've been screamed at many times by writers and by targets of pieces and so on over the years, lawyers also. And I calmed him down and I said, come on, you've got a point to make. You've got an argument to make. Write a letter to the editor. And of course, if you write a letter to the editor, our journalist, our writer will have the right to reply. But isn't that the liberal ideal after all? I mean, we keep arguing infinitely, we hope, so to where nobody gets hurt. In other words, you keep arguing and there's no bloodshed. And that is the liberal ideal. And he goes, no, I don't want to do it. That would be regressive, because I say one thing, he says another, and it just goes on and on. So I said, but that's the whole point. We want it to go on and on, to have a conversation and not have one winner and one loser. Have a little bit of pluralism in the conversation. So a little diversity in the conversation, if you'll pardon the word. And but in the end, he refused to write the letter. He said, I won't do it.
This is extraordinary.
Just extraordinary. At least he didn't resort to Twitter to attack me.
Yeah.
He called me, which is better than nothing.
Yes.
But he wouldn't go for a conversation or for an argument. He's just not interested.
You mentioned the John Hockenberry piece that you guys published. It made me think about the difference between that and Ian Baruma's publication of Jian Ghomeshi's piece about living with Me Too accusations, which was published in the New York Review of Books. And of course, as a consequence, Baruma was elbowed out by the looks of things. There's still some discussion about whether he resigned or was pushed out, but it seems to me to have been an unholy marriage between those two things, which I have thought about for the past few months is a bigger scandal than people seem willing to recognize, because someone of Baruma's stature, who's written about the crisis of tolerance, of course, in relation to the Netherlands and other parts of the world, to be pushed out over the publication of an article. And as he said, he feels it's necessary not to judge people before they've been taken to trial, not to refuse to publish people who've not been found guilty of anything in a court of law. So he was upholding what you might consider to be pretty strong liberal principles, and he's gone. So in the New York scene of publishing, is that recognized as a problematic thing, or is it brushed over?
It's brushed over. In fact, I think, again, there was a sense of exhilaration and triumph that Ian had to walk, that Baruma had to walk the plank. I didn't have to walk the plank because I'm the publisher. They can't fire me. I can't fire myself. I suppose I could have resigned in disgrace, but the horrible thing about it is that there wasn't much protest. There were 100 writers from New York Review, I think, signed a letter, a polite letter saying, while we don't approve of Ghomeshi, we think this is excessive. It wasn't that tough a letter. It was better than nothing. But Ray Hederman has a lot to answer for. He let down our side terribly. And this is a guy who comes out of Mississippi, grew up in Mississippi, and knows all about racial intolerance and how dangerous it was in the 60s for a white Southerner to defend civil rights for black people, to give in to his staff. And I know this is what happened, that he was intimidated by his own staff and by the threat of a university press boycott, advertising boycott. And again, what world are we living in where university presses are threatening to boycott a magazine for expressing an opinion, an unpopular opinion, or allowing someone to express an unpopular point of view. It's just astonishing. So that Hederman was doubly obliged, from my point of view, to defend not only the principle that his editor can publish something that people don't like and not have to quit or not have to be fired, but also that you don't ever give in to an advertiser boycott. The minute you give in to advertisers, you're finished as a publisher. And I worry now that New York Review has lost its compass, its sense of what it was, and that it's going to be in trouble. I don't know. We'll see what happens. They don't really have an editor. They have, I think, 2 editors who I haven't heard of. But they gave in on Hederman has to know better as a liberal than to give in to the mob or to give in to advertiser pressure. But he did. It is a catastrophe. And I'll just say one other thing, that the irony again is that, or the depressing thing for me is that, 15, 20 years ago, I could have written an op-ed piece for the New York Times saying that this is a bad thing, and they would have published it. Not anymore. I don't even bother to try. I have to write it in The Spectator, a conservative British Tory-leaning magazine. That's where I have to go to say this. Or maybe Le Monde Diplomatique. I write now. I'm pretty much limited to left and conservative, far left and conservative publications.
It's the exact same process in the United Kingdom, where if you want to write something in defense of freedom of speech, you don't go to The Guardian and you don't go to The New Statesman, which you might have done 30 years ago. You have to go to The Telegraph or The Spectator.
Or The Spectator, precisely. Which is what I did when I finally figured out how I wanted to address it. I wrote it to address the Buruma firing. It was a firing. I went to The Spectator.
I wanted to ask you, before we carry on with the censorship discussion, because I think that's such a crucial issue of our time, on the Me Too phenomenon, which I find increasingly scary. And one of the things that's most striking about it is it seems to me to have assumed almost a kind of McCarthyite feel, where particularly in Hollywood, as with McCarthyism, everyone fears the pointed finger and the exposure, which could come in a Facebook post or a tweet or an article relaying some bad date someone had or some bad sexual experience. Anything could happen to them at any moment. So there's this climate of fear, climate of censorship, and this sense that even speaking out against it is a scary thing to do. I wrote a piece for the Los Angeles Times about Jeremy Piven. Jeremy Piven, the actor, made a very good point, which is basically to ask the question, what happened to the principle of innocent until proven guilty? Why are people assuming I'm guilty because of 2 accusations made on social media, which I thought was a very good question. But there seems to be an unwillingness, even among liberals who are in favour of due process, or ought to be, to call out this culture in which people's reputations are destroyed on the basis of accusation alone. What do you think is driving that fear to stand up for universal legal principles?
Well, there's famous play, The Crucible, describes it. I should have said a 17th century stoning, not an 18th century. I meant 18th century, we were talking Enlightenment. 17th century, we're talking Puritans in Massachusetts really pursuing witch hunts. And this may be a peculiarly American phenomenon. I've tried to figure this out, and I haven't, obviously, or I would have made some kind of pronouncement. But there's something in this country, and the way we were founded, that demands periodic purifications. And so there's the Salem. It's before the United States. It's still America. There's the 17th century witch trials in Salem, where there's just the hysteria. When you read the accounts of what was really going on, it's really extraordinary, and very, very much like what happened during Prohibition. There was hysteria in the country. They banned alcohol. Imagine, it's still hard to believe that selling or drinking alcohol in a public place was illegal for 11 years, was it? No, more than that. 12 years? I can't remember now. And there was another kind of ritual purification and sort of hysteria. And then, of course, you have the 50s and McCarthy and the Red Scare. Although there was an earlier Red Scare during Woodrow Wilson that doesn't get enough attention. The first Red Scare was in 1919, where Wilson whipped up fear of foreigners, and coming after World War I, when if you were a dissident and you were opposed to America's involvement in World War II, like Eugene Debs, you get thrown in jail for sedition. There was something called the Palmer Raids, named after the Attorney General of the United States, whose name was Palmer. They rounded up hundreds, I think thousands of people and just threw them in jail because of their alleged communist leanings or left-wing leanings. This is, of course, after the Russian Revolution. So that was another period of ritual purification where we had to prove our Americanness or our Christianity or our, more precisely, our Protestant version of Christianity. So Me Too may be another event in a long line of events of self-purification, except that it comes with this underlay of radical, anybody can have sex any way they want, anywhere they want, with whomever they want. And that doesn't really go with McCarthyism. So it may be some kind of a new phenomenon. We also went through a period, if you're interested, of hysteria about daycare centers in the 90s. Men and women, male and female daycare workers were convicted of abusing children. And the testimony in the trials against these people sounded a lot like the testimony in the Salem witch trials. And Harper's published a piece. And again, I am a man of the left, and I have been my whole life. I'm very consistent. But we had to find a right-winger, Dorothy Rabinowitz, who writes for the Wall Street Journal. We didn't find her. She found us to write a piece that ultimately exonerated one of these daycare workers, Kelly Michaels, who during the trial had been accused of flying around on a broom by they allowed the children to testify, the 4-year-olds and the 5-year-olds. And eventually somebody took it up at the Center for Constitutional Rights downstairs from us here at 666 Broadway and litigated it and took it to the New Jersey State Supreme Court, and they vacated they threw out the conviction. So this is not new. But with the amplification of social media, it is something new. It is something crazy.
It's interesting because in Britain, we often get the ripple effect from American hysteria. So we did in the 1990s, we had our own daycare panics. We had the satanic ritual abuse panic came to the UK in various parts of the country. Children taken away en masse from their parents and then returned at a later date. And then, of course, Me Too has come to the UK and is spreading through Europe too, expressing itself in different ways in different countries. I think you're right. It's very interesting to me how something like Me Too both has echoes of the past, but also has something new. So, it really echoes. I always think of the great line from The Crucible, is the accuser holy now? And this sense that the accuser is this figure you mustn't ever contradict. And that echo from the past is right there in Me Too. But then the newness of it, and I say this also as a man off the left and who's always considered himself left-wing, the newness of some of the contemporary panics is that they're often driven not by religious hotheads, but by feminists, and not by kind of, hardcore anti-communist right-wingers, but by people who would describe themselves as radical left-wingers. So I think, is there possibly a broader story here, certainly in the way in which these things express themselves, about the crisis of the left?
Well, I have a very close woman editor friend whose attitude is, she said it to me several times, look, it's like the French Revolution. It's not fair, but heads are going to have to roll for the patriarchy and for the abuse in offices and across society and so on to end. And I take her point. I'm not sure I've even with my predilections I would have favored the terror, but followed the overthrow of the king in France or the execution of the king in France. But reasonable people can disagree about what the best way is to combat sexism and wage discrimination and unequal opportunity and so on and so forth. But to me, this is old hat. It's old news. In other words, I grew up young adult and became an adult in the 70s when I thought intellectual feminism was sort of at its height. It had become a real, it had become a department in universities for one thing, and there were a lot of very distinguished feminist writers writing on different levels and on different themes and so on, published in Harper's Magazine and elsewhere. And I guess I naively had the thought that the argument was won. The feminists had won the day. So it may be also that the backlash that started with Ronald Reagan, this is a backlash against the backlash. In other words, the Reagan comes up just as the Equal Rights Amendment has been proposed in the United States, an amendment to the Constitution, which would finally give the Constitution teeth against sex discrimination. Technically, I think it's the 14th Amendment, which outlawed, in effect, racial discrimination and doesn't mention gender, should take care of it, but it hasn't. It never did. So the Equal Rights Amendment comes up and for ratification, almost got there, missed by 5 states. It would have banned discrimination on the basis of sex, very straightforwardly. But Phyllis Schlafly and her group of Reaganite right-wingers, with a curious mix of arguments, came out against it. Some were traditional. We want women to maintain their roles as mothers and so on and so forth. But she also had interesting arguments like, I don't want my kids serving, my daughters serving in the military and going to Vietnam. And she was quite far right. I knew one of her daughters, and she's a formidable person. I worked on the Sun-Times with her. She was an intern. But I sympathized with Phyllis Schlafly's argument against forcing anybody to serve in the military. But anyway, her argument was largely conservative or right-wing, and the ERA was stopped. It was scuttled, which is a kind of a scandal. So when I get into arguments with Me Too people, I tend to say, well, gee, wouldn't it be more constructive instead of putting Garrison Keillor or John Hockenberry in the stocks or stoning them or driving Al Franken out of the Senate, which was the worst, really a terrible thing to happen. Why don't you re-energize the Equal Rights Amendment? Why don't we start a new campaign to get that started? Because my theory was if a woman is paid the same as a man, or you know that the odds are that the woman in the cubicle across from you or the office across from you is getting paid the same as you, odds are she might end up being your boss. And that's going to get you to cool your jets before you decide to try sexual harassment on her or coercion or whatever. But when I try this argument, which to me sounds like a reasonable liberals argument, I get insulted and accused of mansplaining and the usual stuff.
That's one of the most extraordinary things about a lot of these discussions, which is the difficulty of criticizing or raising objections or raising points because of the identity politics narrative, which says that only certain people can say certain things and others should back off. But one thing I've thought about Me Too, one of the reasons I have a real problem with it is not because of what it does to men, although I do think some men have been treated very badly as a result of the pointed finger of the accusers, but also because of the message it communicates about women. And I always thought that, and Katie Royfeet makes this point very well, where feminism was once about emphasizing the autonomy and capacity of women and their ability to negotiate public life and work life without needing the sexist scaffolding of constant assistance and help and everything else. Whereas now it seems increasingly to have flipped and become an ideology or a narrative which says that women are fragile and vulnerable and at risk. So what I find frustrating is that when people like us criticize Me Too and other contemporary phenomena, we think we're making a kind of progressive left-leaning argument, but it gets fired back at us that we're misogynists or we're racist, depending on the issue. So how do you confront that kind of challenge where name-calling takes the place of engagement at that level?
Well, I'm evidently not doing a very good job of it because I had an infamous now confrontation with Anne-Marie Tremonti, I think it is, on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation last September on the radio over the Hockenberry piece. And I could see, first of all, I'm media trained, so I mostly, if I'm going to do something like this, I insist on going on live because that's the only way you get a word in edgewise.
Yeah.
I mean, I was on. Again, I'm flinging my left-wing credentials at your audience, but I was on. I do the hard work. I take the chances. I went on Bill O'Reilly on the O'Reilly Factor right after 9/11, when the country was again hysterical and they were waving the flag and calling for vengeance and so on, to stand up for, I guess, for civil liberties and for the Bill of Rights. O'Reilly was furious with me, and they never let me on the show again because, anyway. But with Tremonti, I thought, Canadians, who could be more reasonable than a Canadian? These are people who they're polite and so on. But they set up the show with pre-recorded interviews denouncing the New York Review and Buruma and Ghomeshi, who was Canadian and had been tried for criminal assault and acquitted, by the way. Mm-hmm. Or sexual assault and criminal assault and acquitted. And so there's about 7 or 8 minutes of this before I come on, and there's never a mention of the context. In other words, what is Hockenberry? Who is he? And what is his, what's his argument or anything? Nothing. It's left to me. So I say right out of the gate, look, your audience might be interested in knowing that he's a paraplegic, he's in a wheelchair, and don't you think that is something your audience should know? It puts sexual harassment from this guy in a wheelchair in a different context from, say, Harvey Weinstein or Charlie Rose or some other celebrated predator. And she went crazy on me. She got furious with me. What's that got to do with anything? I said, well, he obviously can't jump out of his chair and attack anyone, for starters. So if you're feeling I wasn't able to elaborate, but if you're feeling threatened by him, well, I mean, words can hurt, but he certainly can't do anything to you physically. And so this apparently just is not acceptable context for the discussions. But then I said, why can't Hockenberry make an argument on 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels? Because it has to be one. It's black and white. It's got to be one thing or another. It's either I apologize completely, which was part of the lead into the show. They had a guy. On another show, I heard the perfect apology from someone who had been accused of predatory sexual practices, and this guy, he was a professional actor, and they played his apology, his confession, and his apology on a show called On the Media. Which is on National Public Radio, and the host of the show applauded this because this is the perfect kind of confession and apology. So this guy could be allowed back into society, whereas Hockenberry, because he hadn't apologized properly, he sort of apologized, but not entirely, is not allowed to work again. He can't come back into radio. He can't come back into society. So I then accused Tremonti of having adopted a Soviet tone because to me this sounded like communist or Stalinist or Khmer Rouge rehabilitation. In other words, the only way you can get off the hook is to confess totally to your crime in the right tone of voice. And she was, again, outraged and said, have you ever worked in the Soviet Union? As if it mattered whether we, it's like, I should have said, clearly you did, because you learned their methods. So I'm sort of at a loss as to that's how I've tried to confront it, is with a little bit of sarcasm, some sense of humor, but also sticking to my guns. The problem is nobody is going to invite me now that I've been on that show to some colloquy with angry Me Tooers. For example, we tried to get together a panel of women, all women, moderated by a woman, to discuss Katie Roiphe's piece, which would include Katie Roiphe, of course, on the panel. No prominent woman we invited would accept the invitation because they couldn't be seen with her. They could not be seen with her in public.
It's fascinating because as you were speaking, I was thinking of Stalinism and the demand for the public retraction and the public self-flagellation, and that does seem to be a central part of a lot of the features of contemporary culture. On Women and Me Too, at Spiked, we published a piece called Meet the Women Worried About Me Too, where we got together 13 female voices, and it was a struggle coming up with 13 prominent women. Lionel Shriver was one, Emily Yoffe and Christina Hoff Sommers, and others who were willing to put forward a critical perspective, and I think those are incredibly valuable voices. You're listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. It would be great if you could give us a rating and maybe even a review. That is a really good way to help new listeners discover the show. Just to historicise a bit more where we're at, because you mentioned Rushdie earlier on, we recently passed the 30th anniversary of the fatwa, and so we're having these discussions about Twitter mobs and metaphorical stonings and the clampdown on anything that smacks of a controversial opinion 30 years after the fatwa against Rushdie, which always makes me feel quite depressed because it makes me feel that, in a sense, the Ayatollah won. Rushdie may have won the battle because, thankfully, he's still alive, he's still publishing, he's defying the people who would like him to be killed by carrying on being a writer. But the war seems to have been won by that culture of intolerance, which presumes that if you write something offensive about my religion or my way of life or my identity, you deserve to be punished. So take us back a little bit to the role that you played in defending Rushdie and why you thought that was an important thing to do.
Well, Harper's published, we're the only magazine, English language magazine, probably the only magazine to publish an excerpt of the Satanic Verses, but we published it before the fatwa was declared, before the riots in Bradford and so on. So then when the shit hit the fan and the fatwa was declared and people went nuts, the book-selling establishment and publishing establishment in the United States really disgraced itself. Barnes & Noble and Walden Books took the books off the shelves. I forget which one decided not to sell them at all. The other one, whichever it was, said, you can buy the book, but we're going to hide them in the basement or something, like some crazy thing like that. And so there was widespread panic and fear. And I said to Jerry, right over here in the hallway over here, since we published him, we have an obligation to do something. And he said, why don't we do a reading? And a public reading. So we had to recruit as many famous writers as we could to read from the Satanic Verses. And this is, again, a story I've only been able to tell in the Spectator because the liberal media doesn't want to hear this. But Susan Sontag, who was the head of Penn at that time, flinched at the last minute. We'd organized this thing, and we've got all these very famous writers coming. And everybody's been assigned a section from the novel to read out loud. And there are people chanting, death to Rushdie out on Broadway. This was at Houston or Broadway. Metal detectors, the whole thing. And Susan Sontag comes up to me and says, wouldn't it be better if we didn't read from the novel? Because that might incite people. It might offend them and make it worse. I said, the whole point of this is to stand up for for our right to read it and to speak it. And it would be a terrible defeat, a terrible public relations defeat and moral defeat if people censored themselves and just made statements. And so Robert Stone, a distinguished American novelist, was sitting there, and he was. We drew straws, or no, I decided the order of reading because he was the first to say yes. Very courageous guy. He said, "Of course I'll read. Of course I'll do it." And I said, Bob, please don't give in to this nonsense. Read from the novel. Read what you were assigned to read. And Stone came out and read it, and the whole place relaxed, and it came off. And the panic subsided. Yeah. Books went back on sale, went back to press, and so on and so forth. So I've been through moments like this where, liberals got scared, but other liberals stood up for liberal values, and conservatives as well, right wingers as well, stood up for the First Amendment in that case. And once the panic broke, people came to their senses. With Me Too, no such thing has happened. I keep thinking we're going to publish something that's so decisively logical or rational that it'll break the panic, and people will say, "What happened?
Yeah.
Why did we go mad collectively?"
Yeah.
But it seems to get worse and worse and worse, to the point now where Joe Biden, a guy I just cannot stand, we just trashed him in a cover story in Harper's Magazine. What terrible, much worse than I thought. What a terrible, real reactionary he was over the years, in bed with Wall Street and the banks, and supported all this horrible anti-crime legislation that guaranteed more blacks would be put in jail than whites and so on for the same sort of offenses. Just a terrible politician, terrible person. But even so, he was being pushed as the great moderate, middle-of-the-road alternative to Bernie Sanders to run for president. But none of the things that we said or that anybody else said had any impact on the debate. The only thing that's had an impact on the debate is the fact that he's a real touchy-feely guy and likes to grab people from behind and kiss them on the head and squeeze them. And so he squeezed a lot of women's shoulders and elbows over the years. So that is more likely to drive him out of the race than any of the bad things he did, sucking up to Wall Street or being unfair to minorities. It's absolute, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of it abating.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but because again, you had a cadre, you had a sort of a baseline and a sort of underpinning of the liberal idea and the Constitution in 1980. What was it? 87 or 88? I've forgotten what year the fatwa was.
89.
89.
Yeah.
Sorry, 1989. Today, it feels like it's just kind of washed away.
Yeah. It's what I find interesting about the Rushdie affair is
it was the same thing in England. I mean, you had liberals who should have known better criticizing him.
Absolutely right.
Like my friend David Cornwell and others. It was Harold Pinter by himself with 10 other people.
That's right.
At first, right?
It was a tiny number, and a lot of the
Yeah.
people refused to stand up for him, whether from fear or whatever it was. But
Yeah.
what I find extraordinary about the current period, if we look at the United Kingdom, for example, we now have institutionalized the fatwa mentality. So, for example, the Metropolitan Police, which for a period of time was charged with looking after Salman Rushdie in the early days, now has a stipulation, an actual published document about hate speech, which describes, has a list of things that can be considered Islamophobic, which includes arguing that Islam is a rigid religion or arguing that Islam is inferior to Western values. And what you realize is that the very police force, which for a period of time had to look after Rushdie, might today actually arrest him. So, and if we fast forward to 2015 and the extraordinary situation where 242 authors took umbrage at PEN America's decision to give a Courage Award to Charlie Hebdo, which I thought was the most astonishing abdication of a writer's responsibility to defend even those who have been murdered at their desks.
They boycotted the Penn dinner. They actually boycotted the Penn dinner, which was honoring Charlie Hebdo that year. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up because in countries where, again, because of Charlie Hebdo particularly, they should know better, there's also this new sort of anti-hate speech mob mentality taking hold that's very frightening. And I'm speaking of France. I'm half French, and so I do a lot of TV and radio in France when I have a chance. And I was on a show about a month and a half ago, and the French have now proposed all these laws to suppress the internet, to suppress hate speech on the internet, and punish anybody who says something insulting. And of course, right now it's aimed at anti-Semitic, anti-homosexual, anti-black and anti-feminist, I guess, anti-woman speech. But I'm sitting there on a round table on a TV show, and everybody's saying, "Hump, yes, we've got to suppress. It's terrible, and we can't allow this sort of hate speech to go on unfiltered on the internet." It's understood that it's the government and the courts that are going to decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. They're going to decide how to enforce the law. And I said, my God, after what you've been through with Charlie Hebdo, you don't understand that it depends on your point of view, what's offensive. And if you start trying to choose between points of view, then there will be no points of view expressed freely anymore. How can you defend Charlie Hebdo and not defend the anti-Semites and the racists and so on and so forth on the internet?
Yeah.
And here we are in the country of Voltaire. So it seems to have spread there as well, although there I see a plot between Macron and Zuckerberg of Facebook. They met. I didn't realize until I've been there that they had a big sort of summit meeting.
That's right.
And that's where I think they hatched some of these ideas about how to police the internet more effectively in such a way that Zuckerberg continues to make a lot of money while some people get to speak and some people don't.
Yes, in fact, on the morning of this podcast, Facebook has announced that it has expelled numerous British extremists, including the British National Party, Britain First, Tommy Robinson, and various other kind of hard right-wingers. So explicit political censorship is now
depends on
happening.
whose ox is being gored, but nobody is making that argument from the tradition. They're all saying, yes, hate speech is horrible.
Yeah.
Unacceptable.
I think the governments and liberals often don't realize the extent to which there is an interplay between their unwillingness to defend freedom of speech, including the freedom to offend, and the rise of a violence of censorship. So I've always thought that something like the Charlie Hebdo massacre was in many ways the kind of militant wing of political correctness, because it was driven by entirely the same idea, which is that if you insult my religion, and in Western Europe there are laws which, Michel Houellebecq, for example, was taken to court because he said Islam is the most stupid and grotesque religion. Brigitte Bardot has been fined for her inflammatory comments about the Islamic production of meat and so on. So you think to yourself, these guys have grown up in a country which has told them again and again, these guys, I mean the Charlie Hebdo killers, which has told them again and again that it's awful if anyone criticizes their religion. And you suddenly realize they didn't necessarily have to get this murderous idea from someone in the East. They grew up in a society which told them they had the right not to be offended, which I think is an incredibly dangerous right to give to anyone.
Right. Where's the counterattack coming from? I mean, there are intelligent and rational Muslims who try to make this argument. The problem is a white liberal making the argument has less authority, moral authority now, than a Muslim or an African-American or a feminist. And I'm afraid I've even done a little bit of, to be perfectly honest, I've done a little compensation too, in the sense that we did pick Hockenberry. We didn't pick him. He pitched a piece to us. But I remember thinking to myself, well, after all, he's in a wheelchair. It's not going to be so easy for them to attack him. There's got to be some sympathy out there for a guy who's paralyzed. And it's worse than that. I mean, he's lost, again, he can't work. His wife left him. His children are angry at him and so on and so forth. He's had a rough patch. But he can't do much anymore, and he never could do much to threaten anyone. I mean, he was apparently accused of bullying people in the office, not just coming on to guests who he invited onto his show afterwards, by coming on to them, asking them for a drink. But I probably wouldn't have, I felt safer with him.
Yeah.
I feel safer having Lionel Shriver and Katie Roiphe make the argument than me make the argument. And that's not good either. Yeah. I should be able to make the argument too.
I agree.
Just like, Lionel Shriver's big stunt was to put a sombrero on at a literary festival in Australia, I think it was, to say, here I am appropriating someone else's culture and daring to write about it, to challenge people about this new orthodoxy that a white person can only write about white people and so on and so forth. They can't imagine another character outside of their class or race or whatever.
Yeah. You're listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. If you like this podcast and Spike's other podcasts, and also the articles and essays that Spiked publishes every day, please think about giving us a donation. Spike's content is free, and we want to keep it free, and donations really help us to do that. Head over to Spike's donation page now at www.spiked-online.com. In the brief time we've got left, I want to ask you a little bit about contemporary politics. So you write in French. As you say, you've been on French TV. You speak about French affairs. Of course, France is currently experiencing what I would consider to be a quite exciting revolt, which is very sustained over a long period of time, every weekend for the past 20 or so weekends. A populist revolt. We have a populist revolt in Britain in the form of Brexit. There are populist things happening across Europe. And of course, there's a populist thing in the US too, but it's a bit more complicated and filtered and strange, perhaps. But I wonder how you feel about these kind of bottom-up demands for a new kind of politics or a new approach to politics. Do you feel positive about them as a man of the left?
Well, I'm a little bit divided because my conclusion... the conclusion I drew after interviewing the Gilets jaunes on the Champs-Élysées beginning of March, I wrote something about it. I can't say I'm not an expert, and I spent a couple of hours with these people, was partly I'm a little disappointed that they don't want to organize a political party. I think everybody who follows it knows that most of the Gilets jaunes are actually offended by the idea that they would resort to conventional politics. And actually run a list of candidates or have a leader, a clear leader. And as I was listening to people and talking to people on the street there, I began to realize that what they really cherished was being together, that what they seemed to be really in search of was human warmth. Yeah. And since I'm a longtime critic of, first of all, free trade, orthodox free trade, I'm also a longtime critic of internet culture. I'm a longtime critic of the concentration of wealth and of the spread of big box shopping malls and grandes surfaces in French, which are destroying the downtowns of villages and towns and cities all over the world, but in France as well. I have leapt to the conclusion that these people, they're not starving, these people. They're not doing well. They're poor, or they're lower middle class, or lower middle class. But they're isolated. More than anything else, they feel isolated and ignored. And that the internet is the god that failed. Internet is, notwithstanding the fact that it puts you out to a lot of people, which I think is great, that the hope that you could connect with more people and have a larger community has been smashed to bits, that it's more of an isolating phenomenon than something that brings people together. So to physically get together every weekend on the Champs-Élysées with all these strangers, all these people you didn't know, and then you become friends with from all over France was empowering, ennobling, fun. They looked absolutely thrilled to find each other, which makes it all the crazier that the cops were so violent. The day I was there, they were not. They'd obviously the word had come down to lay off and not beat anybody up or throw tear gas. But these people, I think, don't want to stop demonstrating because they don't want to go back to their lives of isolation and atomization in front of the screen. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, part-time work. France is now afflicted like the United States. I'm not sure what the state of it, how bad it is in the UK, of people working 3 jobs where they used to be able to work 1. Well, one of the places you're able to associate with other humans, even if you hate your job, is at work, at the office. If you're working 3 part-time jobs, it's harder to get to know people, harder to be with people. So I wish they would become a political movement that would overthrow the power structure in France and throw Macron out and so on and so forth. They don't see it that way. They seem to say, and Serge Halimi, the editor of Le Monde Diplo, who said this to me also, why would we stop? Why would we settle for a political party where we get noticed a little bit, or we elect 5 representatives to the National Assembly, when winning, quote unquote, in that way, we all have to go home and resume our awful isolated lives?
Yeah, I completely agree.
So I said on French TV, they said, well, isn't populism a threat to democracy? I said, on the contrary, populism is a response to the suppression of democracy. And the 2 examples that I used were the French rejection of the referendum, where they rejected the European Constitution, 2005, by 55%. A year later, 2 years later, Sarkozy rams through the Treaty of Lisbon, which essentially is the European Constitution by another name, and Parliament adopts it, and no one can say anything. Now it's happening with Brexit.
Yeah.
Whatever you think of Brexit, 52% of the British people voted to leave the European Union, and it looks like there's I hate to use the word conspiracy, but some kind of arrangement between the 2 principal parties to prevent it from happening.
Yeah.
To me, it's very similar to the French situation. So what do you expect? So people go into the street because they're being ignored, and democracy, such as it is, doesn't function in favor in the name of the people.
I completely agree with your depiction of the populist moment as a search for solidarity, a search for community, a search for a sense of collectivity, and
that's the word, solidarity.
And it's
in France they would say fraternity.
Yes,
it's the fraternity part of liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Absolutely,
that's what they want.
And that's what I find quite radical about it, because it is a search for solidarity against the individuating dynamic of neoliberalism, against the individuating dynamic of the new woke politics, where it's all about the self, and against the third way and all these things which tell you you're just an individual, and which tell you that you're a small part of a large machine that you could never possibly understand.
And I wanted to say this because I wanted to say it from the beginning, before we run out of time, that I started out, my woke moment was realizing that free trade was the free trade doctrine, the way it's practiced and debated in this country especially, is a canard. It's a fraud. And I'm sad to say again, it's John Gray, the great British, I think, philosopher, who started out as an advisor to Thatcher and then went way off the reservation and turned against free trade, is the guy who understands this better than I do, even, because he understands that free trade, which is a little bit sort of like the economic version of the internet, where you say no tariffs, no controls, anybody can sell anything anywhere they want, whenever they want, by their rules. It doesn't just destroy the local steel industry or the local farmers or whatever the tariff used to protect. It also destroys the culture. It steamrolls the culture. And once you've destroyed a culture, and I know what it is in France, I've sat at the bar in these little towns that used to have a real commerce, real jobs and a local factory and so on and so forth, where people had a sense of community. It wasn't perfect, but at least they had something that they could gather around. All of a sudden, they have nothing. They have nowhere to go. And how do you recreate that? Yeah. Once the culture, that centre-ville culture is destroyed, high street culture, whatever, you can't just reconstruct it like Notre Dame or whatever.
Yes,
you can't rebuild it.
Absolutely. I want to throw in one more quick question, if I may.
Yeah.
Because I agree. The thing that surprises me about the mainstream left's opposition to the populist thing is I think they fail to see the anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal component, which to me is very strong. But I wanted to ask you just finally.
And then just to say that the mainstream, the debate is going to turn against Trump on free trade in the coming election. And a lot of liberal Democrats refuse to acknowledge that free trade, NAFTA, the deal with China, they're not free trade deals, but they're called free trade deals, are what alienated enough enough Obama voters to push them to vote for Trump.
And that's the kind of thing I wanted to finish on and to ask you about. To what extent do you think someone like Bernie Sanders is capable of doing the kind of thing you've just mentioned? Because it strikes me that almost without realizing it himself, Bernie is engaged in a battle against the new woke left when he says things like class is more important than race and gets a huge pushback, although I think he's absolutely right. When he says things like stop calling me an old white man and talk to me about my policies and my vision of the economy. If he took a few risks, I think he could present a pretty good populist left-wing alternative, not only to Trump, but also to the mainstream Democratic establishment.
Yeah, that's my hope. And of course, I know him a little bit. I'm not pretending to be an advisor, but the 2 times I've spoken with him, I've emphasized that he's got to stand up to the free traders or the fake free traders, but he also has to stand up to political correctness. Because if the minute he gives on political correctness, he kind of sabotages his class argument and we're all in this together and so on. The minute he gives into identity politics, but he also hands Trump a gift because Trump can just ridicule him. The way he ridicules Elizabeth Warren for having claimed she had Indian, Native American ancestry. And it's going to be important because this is the thing that was remarkable about it when he ran the last time is you'd see construction workers who, back in the 60s would have been racist, even anti-Semitic, cheering for Bernie Sanders because he understood the class issue and he understood that the mainstream Democratic Party with the Republicans had sold out the working class in this country with NAFTA and with the it's called permanent normal trade relations with China. So Trump talks the talk. He doesn't believe anything he says. And people say, well, at least he says it. And if Sanders can weigh in on this and keep even with Trump on trade issues, I think he should pick Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, as his running mate. He has a chance to win. He'll win back all the people who voted for Trump. Remember, there are about 8 million Obama voters who voted for Trump. And the election turned on the votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The Electoral College vote, it's about 80,000 people, I think they figured out. If they'd gone the other way, the Electoral College would have favored Hillary Clinton. But I guarantee you, I've interviewed a lot of these people. They're alienated, angry, ex-factory workers who saw their jobs sent to Mexico or China because they would work for 50 cents an hour or $1 an hour in Mexico. And the Democratic Party is not interested in their problems. And I've seen this in the few confrontations I've had since then with mainstream Democrats. They will not address the class issue. They will not talk about the working class. And we're talking about working class, we're talking about all colors, all races, all genders, including transgenders. It's everybody getting the shaft from above. And the more they do the identity politics, the more it chops up the market and makes it hard for somebody like Sanders to win. You better believe that the Clinton-Obama people are they've already done a lot to try to sabotage Sanders. In the first 2 months, they were clearly leaking stories about sexism in the campaign and so on and so forth. He's got to stand up to that if he's going to win.
Rick, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. We'll be back with another guest and more discussion. Don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, keep reading Spiked at www.spiked-online.com.